You have roughly the same number of hair follicles as a chimpanzee. The exact same number, give or take, distributed across the same basic body plan. And yet you look nothing like a chimpanzee. You can walk around in public without a fursuit. You can wear a shirt without it looking like you're smuggling a throw blanket underneath. Somewhere along the line, something stripped almost all of the visible hair off of the human body, and it did it so thoroughly, so completely, that we became the single weirdest looking primate on the planet. And the strangest part of that story isn't the disappearance, it's the exception. One patch survived, on men specifically. On the lower face, the jaw, the chin, the beard, and the question of why that one patch stayed while everything else went is genuinely one of the more fascinating unsolved arguments in all of human evolutionary biology. Let's start with the disappearance itself, because you can't make sense of the beard without first understanding why almost everything else is gone. Hair didn't vanish from the human body randomly, it vanished from specific places, at a specific time in our evolutionary history, for reasons that were almost certainly tied to survival. The current best estimate puts the major shift somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, during the period when our ancestors were transitioning from forest-dwelling primates into open savanna hunters. And the leading explanation for what drove it comes down to one very simple problem: heat. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski has spent decades building the case for this, and her argument is compelling. Early hominins weren't ambush predators. They weren't fast enough, strong enough, or equipped with the right claws and teeth to be ambush predators. What they were, increasingly, was persistence hunters. The strategy was brutally simple. You find an animal, you follow it, for hours. In the midday sun, across open grassland at a relentless pace that the animal cannot sustain even though you definitely can. The prey overheats and collapses. You walk up and finish the job. But it worked, and it worked well enough that it shaped our entire body plan. Because running for hours under the African equatorial sun creates one catastrophically urgent problem. Your core body temperature spikes. Overheating kills faster than starvation does. And thick body hair is the absolute worst thing you can be wearing when you need to dump heat fast. So, the body made a trade. That's the way to think about it. A biological negotiation that played out across tens of thousands of generations. Fur went out, sweat glands went in. Humans today have more sweat glands per square inch of skin than almost any other mammal alive. Millions of them, spread across the entire body surface, capable of producing something like 12 liters of sweat per day under extreme conditions. That is a genuinely absurd cooling system, and it only works if the skin surface is exposed. Fur blocks evaporation. Lose the fur, and suddenly the cooling system that evolution spent all that time building actually functions at the efficiency it was designed for. Sweat evaporation becomes the primary cooling mechanism, and the system can operate at maximum capacity. But here's where it immediately gets complicated. If losing body hair was such an effective survival strategy, why does any of it remain? Because it does. You kept hair on your scalp, and that makes obvious sense because the top of your head is pointed directly at the sun for the entire duration of those hours-long hunting runs. The scalp hair acts as insulation against direct solar radiation. You kept eyebrows and eyelashes, and that also makes sense, because keeping sweat and debris out of your eyes while you're sprinting across the savanna is fairly important for not dying. Then there's the beard. The beard doesn't fit at all. A beard does not help you run faster. A beard does not improve sweat evaporation. A beard does not protect your eyes from debris. A beard sits on the lower face and jaw, trapping heat in a region where some of your most important surface blood vessels run very close to the skin. If anything, on a purely thermal basis, having a beard is marginally worse for a persistence hunter than not having one. So if the cooling hypothesis explains why body hair disappeared everywhere else, it cannot explain why the beard stayed. Something completely different has to account for it. And the leading candidate, the explanation that keeps showing up across multiple independent research directions, has nothing to do with survival at all. It's about dominance and status. Charles Darwin noticed this problem in 1871, which is worth pausing on for a second. Darwin was not someone who missed obvious things. He spent decades building an argument for evolution that accounted for an enormous range of biological phenomena. And even he stopped at the beard and said, essentially, that doesn't fit. He couldn't explain why a trait with no clear survival advantage would persist so consistently across human males, across so many different populations and environments. His conclusion was that the beard wasn't being maintained by natural selection at all. It was being maintained by sexual selection. Two different mechanisms. Natural selection keeps traits that help you survive. Sexual selection keeps traits that help you get chosen. And chosen, in evolutionary terms, means reproduced. Sexual selection is a strange and counterintuitive force when you first encounter it. It can keep traits alive that are actively detrimental to survival, purely because members of the opposite sex find them attractive or because they signal something that makes the bearer more appealing as a mate or as an ally or as a threat. The peacock's tail is the classic example. It's enormous, it's colorful, it makes the bird significantly more visible to predators, and it exists purely because peahens found it attractive often enough over long enough a period that peacocks with bigger tails reproduced more. Natural selection and sexual selection running in opposite directions on the same animal, and sexual selection won. The beard may be a version of the same story. Slightly less ridiculous, but the same basic dynamic. Modern research has started filling in the pieces that Darwin never had the tools to test. Evolutionary researcher Barnaby Dixon ran a series of studies asking participants to evaluate photographs of men at different stages of facial hair growth, from completely clean-shaven all the way through heavy full beards. The findings were consistent enough across multiple trials that they became genuinely hard to dismiss. Heavier beards were rated as more dominant, more mature, more capable of holding resources, more physically formidable. And this wasn't a subtle effect. It wasn't a slight statistical nudge. People made these judgments quickly, confidently, and consistently, which suggests they were pulling on something deeper than conscious preference. Now, here's where the biology gets really interesting, because this isn't just about aesthetics or cultural conditioning. Facial hair growth is directly governed by testosterone, and more specifically, by the density of androgen receptors in the skin of the jaw and chin. The androgen receptor density on the lower face is significantly higher than almost anywhere else on the body. Much higher than, say, the chest or the forearms, which is why men with high testosterone levels show beard growth more dramatically in that specific region. What this means is that a full, dense beard is not decoration, it's a readout of hormonal status. Think about what that means in the context of a small, tight human group living on the African savanna 100,000 years ago. You couldn't run a blood panel on the guy who just walked into your camp. You couldn't ask for references. You had to size people up fast, because your survival could depend on whether you correctly identified someone as an ally, a rival, a potential mate, or a threat. And that guy's face was already telling you something before he opened his mouth. A young male with patchy, thin beard growth read differently than a mature male with a dense, full beard. Different hormonal profile, different physical status, different likely role in whatever conflict or cooperation was about to happen. Reading that signal correctly, fast, could genuinely matter. Ancient humans couldn't choose not to broadcast that information, and they couldn't choose not to receive it. The signal was just there, built into the face. There's a second angle to this that gets less attention, but is worth taking seriously. Some researchers have argued the beard may have also functioned as a form of passive protection, specifically for the jaw, during the kind of close-range physical conflict that was far more common in ancient social environments than it is now. Not armor in any meaningful engineering sense, but bone is not uniform across the jaw, and the tissue around the chin and mandible is relatively vulnerable to blunt impact. A beard provides a small amount of cushioning. One study from the University of Utah actually tested this directly, using synthetic skin structures designed to mimic bearded and clean-shaven faces, and found that bearded samples absorbed significantly more impact energy before the underlying bond. Each structure showed stress. None of these individually might have been enough to preserve the beard against the thermal pressure pushing toward hair loss everywhere else. Together, they apparently were. But there's a deeper layer here, one that the simple sexual selection story doesn't fully account for. The beard doesn't appear uniformly across all human populations with the same intensity. Some populations grow exceptionally dense, fast-growing beards. Others grow considerably less facial hair, or grow it in different patterns. East Asian men, on average, tend to have less dense facial hair than men of European or certain African descent. Indigenous populations of the Americas show a wide range. This variation is real, it's genetic, and it tells us something. If the beard were purely a universal sexual selection signal, you'd expect it to be roughly consistent everywhere. The variation suggests that local environments, local social structures, and local mate preference pressures have been fine-tuning the signal at the population level, even as the underlying biological machinery stays the same. Here's another thing that rarely gets mentioned in these conversations: the threshold effect. Dixon's research didn't just find that more beard equals better ratings. It found that the relationship between beard density and perceived attractiveness is not linear. Clean-shaven men were often rated quite highly for perceived health and cleanliness. Very heavy beards were rated highly for dominance and maturity. But intermediate growth, the stubble and short beard range, consistently scored among the highest ratings for overall attractiveness across the widest range of raters. This is called frequency-dependent selection, and it has a beautiful, devious logic to it. When most men are clean-shaven, beards are rare, and rare signals are more striking. When most men have heavy beards, clean-shaved and faces stand out. The optimal strategy shifts depending on what everyone else is doing. which means the beard is not a fixed signal. It's a dynamic one, calibrated in real time against the social environment around it. Frequency-dependent selection explains something that has puzzled researchers for a while. If beards were straightforwardly advantageous in terms of attracting mates, you'd expect the population to converge toward beards over time. Everyone bearded, all the time. But that's not what happened. The trait persisted in a variable form, with some men growing substantial beards, some minimal, and a wide range in between. Frequency-dependent selection keeps that variation stable. The less common option always has an advantage because it's rare, so the population never converges on one extreme. Both the bearded and the clean-shaven survive, reproduce, and pass the underlying variation on. The equilibrium is the variation itself. Let's talk about what happened when humans moved out of Africa, because climate complicates the beard story in interesting ways. As populations migrated north into Europe and across Central Asia, the UV environment changed dramatically. The intense equatorial sun that made dark skin and maximum sweat-based cooling essential became a low-angle, filtered, frequently absent sun. Cold replaced heat as the primary physical threat, and cold changes the thermal math around facial hair. In a cold environment, insulation on the face isn't a liability. It's actually useful. The blood vessels near the surface of the jaw and cheeks are significant contributors to heat loss in cold temperatures. A beard provides a real, if modest, layer of insulation against that. What was thermally neutral or slightly negative in Africa became thermally useful in Norway. This doesn't mean cold climates caused beards. The genetic machinery for beard growth was already there from the sexual selection pressure operating in warm climates. But it may mean that cold climates removed one of the few remaining reasons for selection to push against it. Now, here's a question worth sitting with. Why do women not have beards? Because women have testosterone too, just at lower concentrations. And women have androgen receptors in the skin of the jaw and chin. The gap is real, but it's not absolute, as anyone who has studied polycystic ovary syndrome can tell you. PCOS involves elevated androgen levels in women, and one of the most consistent symptoms is increased facial hair growth, specifically in the beard regions. That's not a coincidence. It's confirmation that the same hormonal machinery is present, just running at a much lower baseline. The reason women don't typically grow beards isn't that the system is absent, it's that the signal threshold is dramatically different, which raises an obvious evolutionary question. If the beard was selected for because it was a reliable signal of male hormonal status, that signal only works if it reliably distinguishes males from females. A beard that appeared on everyone would be useless as a gendered status display. The sexual dimorphism of the beard, the fact that it appears strongly in males and weakly or not at all in females, is part of what makes it informative. There are a handful of other primates with notable facial hair, and they're worth briefly mentioning because they make the same point from a different angle. Male mandrill baboons have vivid coloring on their faces that becomes more intense with higher testosterone levels. Male gelada baboons have distinctive chest patches that signal reproductive status. Male hamadryas baboons develop large capes of longer fur on their shoulders and necks during sexual maturity. Across primates, secondary sexual characteristics that are regulated by androgens and visible at a distance are extraordinarily common. It's a very recognizable entry in a long catalog of primate status signaling structures. We just happen to be the only primate who debates whether to shave it off every morning. Let's also address the scalp while we're here, because there's a related puzzle hiding right above the beard. Men also experience pattern baldness at dramatically higher rates than women, again, regulated by androgens and androgen receptor density, and again, concentrated in a sexually dimorphic pattern. Male pattern baldness may actually be a related phenomenon to beard development, driven by the same underlying hormonal systems expressing differently in different parts of the scalp. There's even a hypothesis, not universally accepted but not dismissed either, that male pattern baldness persisted because it visually signaled maturity and dominant social status in older males, similar to the graying that happens in both sexes. An older male with visible signs of age might have been a more credible resource holder or protector in contexts where experience mattered. The evidence is thinner here than for the beard specifically, but the conceptual framework is the same. Androgen-regulated secondary sexual characteristics that function as social signals. The archaeological and anthropological record makes it very difficult to pin down exactly when beards became culturally significant versus biologically present, because the biological presence almost certainly predates any cultural record by hundreds of thousands of years. The oldest artistic representations of clearly bearded humans appear in artifacts from the ancient Near East, Egypt and Greece, where beards were associated with authority, divinity, and power in ways that were explicitly formalized. Ancient Mesopotamian rulers wore elaborate braided beards as markers of kingship. Egyptian pharaohs wore ceremonial false beards even when they were women, because the beard had become so strongly associated with royal authority that female pharaohs felt they needed to replicate the signal artificially. Alexander the Great reportedly ordered his soldiers to shave specifically to prevent enemies from grabbing them by the beard during combat, which is simultaneously practical and a remarkable indication of how present and significant beards were in hand to hand fighting at the time. These are cultural elaborations of an underlying biological signal that was already tens of thousands of years old when any of these civilizations existed. The Roman attitude toward beards is particularly interesting. Early Romans were generally beardless, viewing shaving as a mark of civilization and discipline, while associating heavy beards with barbarians and philosophers. Then, when the Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from 117 to 138 AD, grew a beard, the entire Roman elite followed almost immediately. Statues from before Hadrian show clean-shaven emperors. Statues after show beards. The switch was culturally rapid but biologically meaningless. The underlying hardware didn't change. What changed was which configuration of the signal was considered appropriate for the dominant social group. The biology provided the range. The culture chose where to sit within it. Here's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The beard isn't only a signal sent outward to other people. It may also function as a signal sent inward to the man wearing it. There's reasonable evidence that the visible presence of secondary sexual characteristics affects self-perception, confidence, and behavioral patterns. Men who rate their own beards positively tend to show higher self-assessed dominance and status in controlled studies. Whether the beard causes this or whether men who feel more dominant simply grow and maintain beards more deliberately is genuinely hard to untangle. But the psychological dimension of the beard isn't trivial. In a context where social hierarchy was critical to survival, internal confidence calibration mattered. Knowing where you stood in a group, feeling equipped to defend that position, wasn't just ego. It was operationally important. All of this leads to a picture that is considerably messier and more interesting than the simple version of the story. The simple version is, humans lost body hair for thermal reasons. Men kept beards for sexual selection. That's broadly correct, but underneath that summary is a web of interacting pressures. Thermal selection stripping hair from most of the body. Hormonal signaling machinery producing visible output on the face. Sexual selection favoring that visible output in males. Social selection reinforcing its role in status hierarchies. Frequency-dependent selection keeping variation in the population. Possible mechanical protection during conflict providing additional insurance. Cold climate migration removing some of the thermal cost. Cultural elaboration layering meaning on top of biology that was already carrying enormous amounts of information. These didn't operate in sequence. They operated simultaneously, over millions of years, in shifting environments, in changing social contexts. Evolution doesn't run one tidy experiment at a time. The really striking thing, sitting at the end of all of this, is that the beard is essentially a piece of biological technology that most people interact with every day without thinking about what it actually is. It's a signal. An ancient, persistent, hormonally calibrated, socially interpreted signal that has been functioning in roughly its current form for somewhere between 2 and 3 million years. The razor is about 4,000 years old, depending on how you count. Bronze blades used for shaving have been found in Egyptian and Mesopotamian context going back roughly that far. So for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, no one was making any decision about the beard at all. It was just there, doing its job, being read by every person who looked at you in the way that faces have always been read, instantly, automatically, below the threshold of conscious thought. The modern situation is genuinely strange from that perspective. Men now make a daily active decision about a signal that their ancestors never had the option to suppress. Shave and you remove it. Let it grow and you're running the original factory settings. Style it and you're consciously editing an output that your endocrine system is still producing, whether you engage with it or not. The underlying biology is identical to what it was 100,000 years ago. The hormones are the same. The androgen receptors are the same. The signal is still being generated. The only thing that's changed is that now there's a razor in the picture, and someone has to decide every morning what to do with information that used to make its own decisions entirely without any input from anyone.